Hello and welcome back, dudes and dudettes. This is obviously Sugi JRPG here at your service, and today I'm gonna be reviewing, finally, the Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered Edition for Nintendo Switch. And I'm gonna be breaking this review into three parts. First, we're gonna be talking about all the new stuff in the Remastered Edition, then we're gonna be focusing on the gameplay, and then lastly, we are gonna be talking about the story and the world of Crystal Chronicles. So let's start with the new stuff. Obviously, now we have HD graphics, and the game looks significantly better than it did on actual original GameCube. We have now HD resolutions to match our modern TVs and monitors. A lot of the textures inside the game has been upscaled and polished when it comes to the player controlled heroes and also the actual monsters inside the game. Also the special effects and all the objects that are lying around, moving things like the gates, elevators, bridges, and stuff like that. All of those have been upscaled and polished in terms of the textures and look significantly better. One of the things that they didn't do, however, is actually upscale the ground textures and the cliff textures, which still kind of seem a bit outdated, I have to say, and maybe there could have been a bit more work towards that. However, making it this makes like a lot of more objects and the characters a lot more distinguishable on the map, which can get a bit more confusing when you actually have 4 players on the actual game and, you know, moving around on the screen. And then there's obviously improvements on the actual water engine. So the water used to be like a bit of like a texture on a loop. Now it's like a bit more like a lively water, and it's significantly better than it did on the original game. So they saw a lot of work on the actual water engine there, which is very impressive. There's also improvements on the actual UI, which looks quite roughly a bit more modern version, and it's been moved around a little, but it's not very significant in terms of a lot of the changes. A lot of people wanted to see a lot more quick buttons on the actual keys, and so you could map out like quick moves and shortcuts on your controllers, but that is sadly not an option. That's something that the game probably should have actually gotten inside once this remastered was actually done. And the minimap is also a very nice feature, although a lot of people were requesting, like, can we get actual maps that we can watch and see after we have done the map, or completed the map, basically. Then there's English voiceovers for the first time. I don't know that were there like a Japanese version on the original. That is something that they probably should have added support for, so I would have loved to play the game on Japanese as well. But I have to say, a lot of these voice actors were really great, and I think they were great pickups. A lot of the time you don't actually see any dialogue because the main character doesn't actually speak, so in the cutscenes mostly, and the narration done by the woman when you enter to each of the maps for the first time. And then obviously on some of the end of the year there's always going to be that dialogue where there's going to be some talk. But English voiceovers for the most part pretty great. A lot of overhaul has been also done on the music side of things. Also, one of the biggest content-wise updates is also that they added high difficulty dungeons after completing the game for the first time. So there's sort of like a new game plus with all the dungeons with added difficulty in terms of more monsters and more harder bosses, so in case you're looking to grind the game a bit more with your friends. Then it's obviously the multiplayer, which has been very controversial, obviously. So now there's no longer coach co-op. Now you have only online, and this is going to be cross-play, so I can play with my Nintendo Switch with people on PlayStation, on iOS, and Android, which is a very, very nice feature. Also, there is the light version, which allows people to get a free version of the game that they can play with their friends, as long as one of the friends have the actual full game, and they can complete all the dungeons together. And then there's a couple of new models and skins added for each races of the actual game. And there's a lot of other minor stuff that also has been added inside to the game in terms of the multiplayer selected things. Other aspects of criticism regarding the multiplayer is that the actual progression only happens for the one player only, but I guess some people don't care about the actual village building element, I guess, and they just want to clear the game, so to speak, and everybody still gets items after clear the dungeon, so they get stronger because there's no actual leveling system inside the game. In terms of the frame rate, there were only a couple of instances where the frames were dropping down, but mostly it is pretty steady. It could have been better, I have to say. It's a pretty old game, and this should have been something to be addressed definitely inside the game. One of the other things that I did mention also on, my friend, was the loading times on going into the maps and going back to the world map and back and forth. Felt a bit too slow for a game this old, so that should have been definitely addressed and fixed on. So I felt the loading times were unnecessarily slow for a game of this stature and oldness. And now kind of progressing to some of the things and feedback about the gameplay, and then going into the actual gameplay aspects. So one of the quality of life changes that they should have added, in my opinion, damage numbers, full maps, which I already touched upon, skipping cutscenes. That is actually coming on a patch, guys, so you can skip all of these caravan events that happen on when you move from one to one. But this is where a lot of the backstory around the game happens, and I will talk a bit about it on the story part. And then obviously when you're going into a dungeon in a multiplayer, the only way to actually exit from it is actually by dying. In single player you can move out from it, and also it would be nice to have the cupo on when nobody has actually joined inside the game, and the cupo would disappear once a player appears on the actual game. And I felt like those are kind of quality of life things that they should have added into the game. A lot of the menu stuff and like switching over the abilities is quite a hassle in multiplayer, because in single player you can pause and change your setup, which is very similar to the Kingdom Hearts, by the way. But this is a lot more clunky, and this is something that they should have addressed. Allow players to, map some of the abilities and skills into certain buttons in your PlayStation controllers would have been a very good thing to do, but they didn't do that. Now let's get into the actual gameplay. So, starting off with a lot of information that people are probably interested in. The game is around 11 to 12 hours long, and that is me helping my other friend to play a couple of the maps over again, and me doing a couple of the maps like twice over. But you can definitely speedrun the game around in 9 hours, especially the latter part of the game or the final dungeon. That's where kind of it's very long part of the game, I have to say. And for the most part the game allows you to grind more, but it doesn't really have like a proper progression system, so you only progress by getting new items, smithing items to the blacksmith, and also through completing the levels, which will give you stat bonuses. This can be a 1 health bar more, or it can be 1 defense, 1 strength more, or magic basically, and then there's some other things that can be dropped. Basically, this is the only way you progress throughout the game. So no matter how many monsters you kill inside on the maps, doesn't actually matter. And I'm not really a big fan of that system. I think there should be some type of progression that you get by killing monsters. You get like extra talents or something. I don't know, but I'm not a big fan of this model. I like my spear grits and I like my levels. Okay. The guild economy in this game was okay. This is something that has deteriorated a lot since like Final Fantasy X, in my opinion. This is something that I talked about in 15 and 13, where guild was kind of useless unless you were like hunting achievements basically. And in this game you only needed to like make some recipes inside the game, and it was really annoying to get certain recipes for races that you didn't own. So there's 4 races in the game. You have the humans, you have the metal knight things, and then you have those weird Timo, Kupo mixture creatures, which are like dwarves, and then you have like these more sexualized humans, basically. Gelki, Silkies, and the humans, whatever their names are, it doesn't matter. And all of them have a bit more different base stats, otherwise they don't really have much difference. Ones have shields, one have spears, and ones have staves, and ones have these like weird rods of sorts. I don't know what to even call them. And I kind of like the race functionality, but there's not really a lot of difference between them. Usually when you play World of Warcraft, you would expect a lot of discrepancy between the races, but then again you can always create a new character and level it up, and there's kind of also another functionality of the game which increases replayability for the most part. And also, like, the combat feels like antiquated Kingdom Hearts in a way. It's kind of clunky. It's not fluid and smooth as I would have hoped to, but it's a very old game, so I understand that. But I mean, if they ever do like a new entry on the game, I really want to play more like Final Fantasy VII and between Kingdom Hearts 3. So that was not like the most fun experience. I felt like it was a bit sluggish at time, and it kind of feels like a bit of a Dark Souls game in that sense that you're dodging attacks and stuff like that, and that's kind of like the action RPG style, but you want to have fluid controls, you can time things and dodge things on a good manner. So I like fluid gameplay, and in that sense the game hasn't really aged that well. And the game is obviously around $30 only, so in terms of when you adjust to that actual to the game length, we have actual games that cost $60 and are 12 hours long, so I'm not going to be complaining too much because the price wasn't really that high. And in terms of like the gameplay, I kind of like that. The progression is kind of all over the place because of the multiplayer aspects, and I'm not a really big fan of the just getting the attributes and don't having a spear grid or levels, so I wasn't a fan of this. The combat was okay, and I kind of liked also the spell fusion stuff, so it wasn't like too bad in the gameplay aspects but that's something a lot of people didn't address, so I thought I would be addressing that. Also, like, moving around the world map is kind of hassle because all the cutscenes come around all the time, and it feels very slow, especially because there are a lot of loading times inside the game, so it was kind of frustrating at times. And sometimes also there were some rigged elements inside the multiplayer, like joining right before the boss and you didn't really have to do any work and still get the item reward, and you could basically AFK on the actual multiplayer maps and still get a reward long as the other people beat the bosses. So there's some fundamental like bad design choices there when it came to the multiplayer and how they like set this multiplayer up and didn't include co-ops and stuff like that. The bosses were actually pretty nice because some of them have multiple phases and they kind of like interesting mechanisms, which I liked. Really hated the last boss, not gonna lie. That was one of the longest things and most cruciating things, and I almost give up playing the game and completing it because the last dungeon and the boss that has like 3 stages, kind of like the first phase has like 3 stages, and then there's like additional 2 stages like of another boss. So like, oh my god, that was horrible. I didn't like that at all. And now we're gonna be getting into the actual story and the world. So a lot of the story revolves around the world being clothed on this miasma, and these warriors have to go into these dungeons to get the drop of mirror from these crystal trees, basically, and once they bring it back, the crystal can protect the villagers from this evil gas, basically, the miasma. And I like this model, like this idea and the base core concept of the story. It's a bit of a pilgrimage, but kind of like going back, and there's sort of a base building element inside it as well, but not quite exactly. I mean, it could have benefited a lot more from city building elements and like having, there's a lot of very good JRPGs that have done base building right. Skies of Arcadia comes into my mind right now, and a couple of others. But I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity when the game first came around. And I feel like a lot of the gameplay mechanics are like outdated, but I would really enjoy to see like a modern version of Crystal Chronicles to come out. In terms of the world, you have a lot of like classical monsters coming back, your bombs, tomberries, cactuars. This has to be one of the weakest cactuars we ever seen inside a Final Fantasy game, by the way. And I kind of like this sort of a folktale, very European fantasy type of a setting here. One thing I forgot to mention on the previous part was actually the music. So the music is a big part of the story, and it gives us a bit of a feel of this sort of a lot of the music tracks, I feel, to me are like this circus fair carnival type of a music, and there's not like these epic battle music tracks inside the game, sadly, like this high tempo fast battle drumming or anything like that. And that's something that I wish to see, because at least on a final boss battle, because that's like a trademark of Final Fantasy, but we didn't see that. I like the soundtrack, the opening is great, but I think it lacks variety. And also when it comes to the story, a lot of it really happens on the beginning, where they kind of set this whole premise around the world, what's going on. And then when the year ends, so when you come back home and there's like this sort of a, journal that the main character keeps of his journeys and encounters on these side quests or side events that happen around the map. And that's where the kind of all the story happens. And then you go into the final dungeon, and then there's like a sudden vast fucking blimp of story just thrown into your face. And it feels like, oh, we're gonna be packing all the story in the last 5% of the game. Kind of reminds of Kingdom Hearts 3 in that sense. So the story is not a masterpiece, even in a on spin-off way when we compare this to other Final Fantasy spin-offs. World of Final Fantasy had a great story, by the way, but yeah, this story was very non-existent. It wasn't bad, really what the fuck in terms of compared to 15 that had a bad character development. But it's I don't like these when the character doesn't talk or doesn't really have any story of his own. He's just a random adventurer and he's going to the dungeon, bro, and killing the final boss, which appears out of fucking nowhere and doesn't have any background context around him prior to the final dungeon. So, I mean, the story is a goddamn mess, but it's kind of like a multiplayer experience, so we can classify it as kind of an MMO game in that sense. So MMOs don't have to have a great story. Kind of wrapping things up, it's pretty much game for nostalgia fans. Maybe if you can get couple of friends to play with, it's gonna be much finer experience. I played half of the game with random groups, no problem there, but you have no voice talk, so that was an issue too. So you had a really hard time to communicate, and you had this sort of Dark Souls, goddamn useless to conveying the information you want to. And then I really hated, by the way, that desert puzzle, which how the people are supposed to know what they're supposed to do there, okay? And that was really a mess in my opinion. So and then the fifth element, and it was not good. And so the game, in terms of the old games, always had a problem telling the player what exactly should they do next, even a bit of a hint, what the group should be doing next. Yeah, that's pretty much my review. Sorry for making it long, but I wanted to kind of address all of these points. It wasn't a bad purchase. I'm not going to regret it. I expect it to be a bit longer of a game. I'm definitely not interested in the late game content because I just don't find the gameplay as satisfying. There were a couple of these sort of loopholes here which I didn't like, and the execution, as other people said, in terms of the multiplayer, could have been better. A lot of quality of life changes, really small adjustments could have made a ton of difference into the game, making it better. But ultimately, this was kind of a lot of people wanted to play it on multiplayer, so single player aspect versus player multiplayer, you're joining random groups, and if you don't want to have a progress with a friend, it's pretty okay. But if you want to progress with a certain specific friend and going through the dungeons together twice, it's not something you actually want to do, because not all the stages are actually great. Some of the levels are funnier than the others, and some of them are more puzzle and labyrinth-like, and some are much shorter and easier to do. But yeah, I'm kind of mixed on those, and the bosses also kind of a mixed bag, but most of them were okay and well done. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more, and I will see you guys on the next video. Cheers.